Cetățenii așteaptă două lucruri de la noi. Să trăiască mai bine și să le se facă dreptate.
It was an unlikely alliance and an unusual experiment. When the pro-Western Akum party teamed up with their arch rivals, the pro-Moscow socialists, to form a government this summer, a government that was backed by the United States, the European Union, and Russia, Moldova seemed on the brink of a breakthrough. Or maybe not, because that government has since collapsed, presidential elections loom next year, and the struggle for Moldova has entered into a crucial new phase. And what happens in this small European country has implications not just for its 3.5 million citizens, but for the rest of the former Soviet space, for Europe, and in the geopolitical struggle between Russia and the West. So what is going on in Moldova? What happens next? And why does it matter? Listen up to find out. Hello from SIPA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and welcome to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. And joining me here in the studio is Corina Rebegea, director of the U.S.-Romania Initiative and fellow in residence here at SIPA. Welcome back to the podcast, Corina.
Thanks, Brian. It's good to be back.
Good to have you back. Seems like we do this every 5 months or so. Also joining us in the studio is former U.S. State Department official Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA, and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome back, Don.
Thank you. Nice to be back, my friend.
I haven't seen you in at least a few hours. So last month, Moldova's pro-Moscow president, Igor Dodon, appointed his ally, and Corina, correct me if I pronounce this incorrectly, Ion Chichu? Kiku. Okay, there we go. Ion Kiku prime minister, just a day after pro-Western prime minister Maia Sandu's cabinet lost a confidence vote after just 5 months in office. This ended an alliance of convenience between Sandu's Akum party and the socialists and brought the misnamed Democratic Party of fugitive oligarch Vlad Plahotniuc back into the government. Corina, how did we get here and what should we be looking for going forward?
This is how long do we have to answer that question?
The Cliff Notes version.
Well, I think it depends on how you look at it. If you have your optimistic lens on, it's going to be different than if you're looking at it from a very pessimistic point of view. I think if you're an optimist, you can say, well, the government actually, Maia Sandu's government managed to stay in office far longer than anyone expected.
5 months?
5 months is longer than what, for instance, part of the civil society was asking for, which was early elections. So they should have been just a caretaker government for a couple of months, arrange for new elections, and then move forward from then. And also on an optimistic note, while they were in office, they managed to unlock international funding for Moldova, and that was crucial so that the budget doesn't fall off the brink, and the entire country collapse. Also, the people in public administration got sort of a breather. They got to see what a reformist government might look like. And it was very good for the two parties that are a part of the Akum alliance, PAS and PPDA, so Maia Sandu's party and Andrei Năstase's party. And the new people in these parties to actually experience the act of governing. And that prepares them for what's to come. So I think if you look at it from this perspective, it was a win for Moldova and for the truly pro-European forces of Moldova. Of course, they were stopped right before they were actually able to implement the most significant reforms that all of the Moldovan citizens wanted them to implement and wanted to see. You may remember when Maia Sandu's government took office, their plan was to de-oligarchize the country, which they managed to do to a certain extent. Plahotniuc is out of the picture.
Plahotniuc is a big part of that. Yeah.
Exactly. And so he is a fugitive now. We don't know where he is. There's an international warrant against him.
Apparently he has several identities.
He has 3 that we know of. I think the names are known for the other 2.
Vladislav Vladimir Novak was the one.
And then there's another one. I can't remember the name right now, but there's a third one. So we don't know. Apparently, he used one passport to get into the United States. That was his first destination when he left Moldova, but then used a different passport to get out. So we don't know. I mean, there are speculations about where he might be, but he makes appearances on Facebook every now and then with political messaging. But he's lost control over the party. He's lost control over some of his assets. And if the criminal investigation against him continues in Moldova, we might see even more of that in the near future. Of course, the vacuum that he left is now being occupied by President Dodon, and we can get into more details.
And if I can play pessimist a little bit, I mean, Dodon has managed to place allies in the Speaker of Parliament, Defense Ministry, the Interior Ministry, so he's consolidating power. His new prime minister immediately got a meeting with Dmitry Medvedev in Moscow, and Moscow seems to be consolidating its position in Moldova. So is this, it's well taken, the positive points you put out there, but I see also some negative signs, and I hate playing the role of the pessimist, but I'm going to do it for
Well, of course, there are lots of negatives, and I just started talking about one, which is the Sandu government had to leave office before they could implement the real reforms, and we're talking about the main anti-corruption rule of law reforms, cleaning up the judiciary, creating a better system for the recruitment of judges and prosecutors, including tests for their professionalism and integrity. This really just her plans created an earthquake inside the system. And this is actually what triggered her dismissal. The attempt to give the position of the general prosecutor to someone who's upright and doesn't have political connections and so on. So this got stopped on the way. This is actually what's on the real agenda of the Moldovan people.
And that's what caused the government to lose the vote of confidence.
Exactly. But of course, if you read Moldovan media and talk to analysts on the ground, they say that this was the plan from the beginning. So this was just the socialists, together with Plahotniuk's former party, the Democratic Party, were waiting for an opportunity to the plans had been drafted before. They were just waiting for the right time to get rid of Maya Sandu and her people in the government. And I think that was quite obvious when we look at the speed with which the new majority in the parliament got formed, the new government was voted in. This all happened almost overnight. So President Dodon had his government team prepared to take over day one, which they have.
Don, it seems we've seen this movie before, not just in Moldova, but in other former Soviet spaces.
Exactly.
How do you see it? Are you getting deja vu watching this?
I'm getting deja vu, and I
going?
refer the group here to the headline on the Current Economist article this week, A Quiet Takeover. I learned a lot from Corina last time about this issue of the Russians cooperating or not, and I think we left it relatively optimistically, didn't we?
Yeah, we did.
I think, as I recall, 5 months ago, and I just find I read all this stuff this week and wondering what are we not getting at this story, because you've got Russia's, I was going to say, acquiescence to what happened in step one, and then you get a furious summer campaign of visits, Shoigu and other people, and you get all these deals at once. And I would love to know be at the table with the Moldovans and the Russians and when all of this went along. But to answer your question, yes, Brian, we see this in a lot of places, each one with its own local flavor. Yeah. And we have to, I think, give the Kremlin credit. You notice how I paused there. Give the Kremlin credit for its usual tactical versatility and dexterity, where they can go one way and then the other, as they often do on other issues in other places, and apparently carry off an operation which allows them to be much closer than they were a year ago or 6 months ago.
Well, I mean, the way I see Moldova right now is kind of like pre-Maidan Ukraine. You've got basically a 50-50 society. And you're never going to get a full-on consensus to move west.
Yeah.
And you're never going to get a full-on consensus to embrace Russia. You got this almost as what you had in Ukraine before the war. Okay. And you can almost substitute Dodon for Yanukovych in a lot of ways. Yeah. And so nobody is able to pull together a consensus. And Moscow is operating in that kind of environment. Maybe that suits Moscow, because as long as Moldova doesn't full on go west, Moscow's getting enough of what it wants, I think. I don't know, would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's not really creating chaos as we often talk about in this program, but it's
creating
the pot,
gridlock.
Yeah, it's keeping the pot boiling. And, we on this program and in this office, we spend a lot of time on Georgia, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova.
Yeah. Now, the tactics, and we're going to get into this in the second half about Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, as we always kind of lump them together. But in a place like Georgia, where you do have a consensus to move west, they use different tactics.
Exactly.
Stealthy, boiling the frog
in
in water
ask
tactic.
Corina, this issue of the strength of civil society. In Ukraine, it's a break.
Yeah. It's a force. It's a force to be reckoned with.
Would you compare it to Ukraine or to not as strong? We've compared it to Georgia with visitors this week. And Ukraine, it's more of a break, and maybe that's because the elites are more pro-Western.
Ukraine, it's more than a break. It's almost a driver.
Yeah, and maybe it's because the elites are more pro-Western than in Georgia now and Moldova. But I don't know.
But even it also depends on how you assess the strength of civil society. I think in the past years, NGOs in Moldova have become a lot more powerful. They've developed a lot of expertise. They are more present in debates. They're more present here. They're able to get their voice across. So I think civil society is doing well. I think media is doing very badly in Moldova right now. And I think that's something everybody needs to pay attention to. But also in Ukraine, this has been a constant battle. Even though civil society is so strong, and most of the good proposals came from civil society, actually, especially when it comes to the rule of law agenda, still that's a continuous battle. We haven't really reached the destination. So in a way, it's comparable, but it's a different scale of things.
Ask a question again.
Go ahead.
How have they reacted to the developments since the beginning of November?
They're not as pessimistic as we are.
Well, that's very interesting.
Well, that's good. That's good. That's a good sign.
And also, just going back to the points you were making earlier about Russia and whether Russia is gaining ground, and I think it's a game of narratives here. We haven't paid enough attention to Moldova, I think, in general, not the three of us. So we don't really have a baseline of where Russia was and what Russia is. It's all.
That's a good point.
So I think, what are we comparing this with? If you ask me, of course, in terms of official visits and more diplomatic relations and kind of the facade of things, they seem like they are. But even under the Plahotniuc regime and even before, they were doing their business and their games and their laundromats and the Russians, just perhaps even with more intensity than they are now. I mean, we'll see what happens in the next few months. I think the question is, what role does Moldova play in Russia's strategy for the region? And I think we haven't figured that out completely. There are lots of speculation, of course, on how the Kremlin might use Moldova in its games with Ukraine. And now we have this new scandal with the energy contracts, right? They haven't signed the new gas.
And they would like to get a settlement in their favor on Transnistria, which might serve as a model for the Donbass. That's that. Although I think that is pure fantasizing on their part, because the Ukrainians aren't going to let them get away with that. The Ukrainians know what they're after in the Donbass, and they're not going to give it to them.
Or maybe they just want to say, look, dear West, we were able to play our game in Moldova, and you played along, and you didn't understand what we were doing, and so we still retain whatever influence. But But I think pragmatists in Chișinău know where their resources come from, and that this is not Russia.
Right.
And if you want to win elections, you can't win elections just based on promises, And we've had that. Remember, even last year, Dodon made I don't know how many visits to Moscow, met with Putin, got a lot of promises on all the good things that Russia was going to do for Moldova, and nothing came of it. Now they're getting more promises,
yes, exactly.
And there was just a bunch of new deals signed for infrastructure projects and energy projects, but the Russians are great at pledging these things, and then everybody forgets about it, and there's not really a lot of follow through. There was a very interesting piece put out this week. I know you both have read it, by the Institute for the Study of War. Our friend Natalia Bugayeva was the co-author on that, and she paints a pretty pessimistic picture here, arguing that this has been kind of a sequenced kind of takeover by the Russians, first getting rid of Plahotniuc, and then getting rid of Maia Sandu, and if you remember 5 months ago, we were wondering what was going on with Plahotniuc, because he's always been playing both sides against the middle. He was never the West's guy.
No.
And he was never the Russians' guy. He was playing his own game. And we concluded here on this program, in this room, into these microphones, that both sides had basically gotten sick of him and said, let's get rid of this idiot. We can fight each other without him. And that's how I saw it at the time. Now, the way this piece in the Institute of Study of War presents it as the Kremlin got rid of Plahotniuc, who was a problem. And I agree, the Kremlin he wasn't entirely a pro-Kremlin guy, or he wasn't entirely a pro-Western guy either. And now they got rid of Sandu, and now they got a free hand. And I think it's a compelling argument, especially when you look at what's happened since, or before or around this time. Dodon, Moscow's man in Chișinău, has the mayor's office of Chișinău, the speakership of parliament with his people, the interior ministry, and the defense ministry. Am I missing anything, Corina?
The intelligence.
The intelligence services. So he's got the Siloviki, the capital, the parliament, the presidency, and the government.
Some would argue in civil society that he doesn't have the capital city. Some would argue that actually Ion Cioban, the mayor of Chișinău, is actually a competitor inside the party, and that Dodon feels threatened. Cioban actually, since he took office, had, as you know, a few engagements of his own in Moscow. He met including with Kozak, right?
And with Sobyanin, the mayor of Moscow. Yes,
exactly. He actually also traveled to Bucharest and got a meeting there. He wanted to get a meeting with the mayor of Bucharest, but also only got a meeting with one of the administrative units within Bucharest. So if that's true, I think just as before, Moscow, and here I'll make a note that we don't know, we tend to see Russia as a monolith.
Yes.
And it's becoming clear, becoming, in terms of Moldova, it's becoming clear that there are different factions betting on different actors in Moldova. Yes. Yeah. And this is not new. We know Dodon had his support, Renato Usati had his support. Perhaps it's still there. Perhaps he can make a comeback. Plahotniuc had his. And now it seems like Ion Cioban has his own as well. So it's not. I don't think it's that easy for President Dodon. He's still perhaps consolidating his power. It may just be an illusion that he's actually succeeding in doing so.
My advice, if you want to watch where Moscow is going, watch Dmitry Kozak. He is Putin's Mr. Fix-It. This is his brief. You have the Kozak plan, which goes way back. If you want to watch, Moscow is not a monolith, but there is a decider. Right. And Kozak is the Mr. Fix-It man of the decider. I mean, Kozak's kind of like Putin's Mr. Wolf on Pulp Fiction, right? He solves problems, right? So.
And maybe we can find out what instructions he has given the mayor of Chișinău when they met.
There was a time when I had a cell phone number back in the 90s, but I don't have it anymore.
It's a very interesting question. 2 weeks ago, Brian, we talked about the Stanovaya article about Ukraine.
Yes.
She says there's 3, did she say clan? Did she even use the word? And I had Moscow contacts say, no, it was not anywhere near as clear as she says in the article, within Putin, the decider in Ukraine, whatever. But if we go over the list of Russian visitors, Corina, this month, Kozak, Patrushev, Medvedev, Shoigu. That to me suggests not a monolith, but a concerted Russian campaign of pressure, inducements, or whatever. But to me, that's not a monolithic Moscow position. They want something. Probably
they want to stop Moldova from moving into Western structures.
Yeah.
They want to keep Moldova divided and paralyzed and in gridlock. Mm-hmm. That's basically the plan right now. I mean, it's the same plan in Ukraine, because from that baseline, it's easier for them to ultimately gain control and pull them back into the sphere of influence.
But I think in Ukraine, the costs of continuing, and as you know, we were at
there's
dinner
not
with
a
John
hot
Herbst
war
last
going
night
on.
about this, is much higher. In Moldova, a lot of this is high-level kind of diplomatic, money, pressure games. But I'm very encouraged by what Corina says about we shouldn't take it as gloomy as it first seems. I hope not.
It's pretty gloomy, but half of the electorate still looks towards the West. I think we shouldn't forget the Moldovan people and the Moldovan civil society. And I think that's an important point. We've seen that in the presidential elections when Maia Sandu ran against Dodon and almost defeated him. That's tremendous. I think we shouldn't take the fact that we have a socialist mayor of Chișinău as a defeat necessarily of the pro-Western forces.
Because you see splits in the Socialist Party.
There are splits in the socialist. This was a negative vote towards Andrei Năstase, unfortunately. And I think people are just fed up. And it was also, I think it was good because they sort of, if I can use this expression, showed their muscles, right?
Yeah.
The people are not stupid.
Well, this is interesting because we have presidential elections coming up in less than a year's time. They're going to be like around, the date's not fixed yet, but I'm guessing around October of next year, which is going to be interesting. Georgia and Moldova are both having elections next autumn. Sandu could run in those elections with the experience of being the prime minister for 5 months in her pocket. Mm-hmm. She could run as somebody who was thwarted in her efforts to reform Moldova. Now, the Dodon's people are, from what I understand, and the Russians are putting a massive disinformation campaign about how she is incompetent and she's just not up to the job. And there's a little bit of sexism involved in that, I think, as well.
A little bit more.
A little bit more than a little bit of sexism in that. I don't know how effective that campaign is going to be or how she's going to be able to play the card of the, I don't want to say martyr, but kamikaze pilot who could, tried to get this done, but was thwarted by the old boys network. I don't know the Moldovan electorate well enough to know how that played. She came damn close last time.
She did, and I think the campaign against her, the information campaign against her was absolutely horrifying. Mm-hmm. The last time she ran.
We can count on the same thing again.
Possibly, but here's the thing. Also, for all of us, observers or people who are involved one way or another in Moldova, I think that the year before the presidential elections in 2020 is very important, and maintaining pressure to make sure the process is correct. And by process, I mean not only that people don't cast 2 votes instead of 1, right, but also looking at the media space and how independent media actually is able to reach the Moldovan population, equal access for candidates, all of the things that happened in the campaign for the parliamentary elections in February this year that weren't addressed properly, I would say, when they happened earlier this year. I think we should pay attention to that. And I think whatever money comes from, and this is something that I've heard from civil society activists in Moldova, whatever conditionalities on international funding going into Moldova should include the elections, the process, and preparing for the elections, because otherwise we are not sure. I mean, we have to ensure a level playing field, and I think Maya Sandu has pretty good chances if there's a level playing field.
You made an interesting point when we were talking off mic earlier today, where basically the kind of money Moldova needs cannot be provided by Moscow. It can only be provided by the West and the IMF. And if Maya Sandu could make the case that only she could deliver that money, that's
she can. She proved it.
She's proven it. And
yeah.
But there's reality and there's perception. If she can make that case convincingly to the Moldovan electorate, then that would help her case significantly, I would argue.
I think everybody saw that. She came to office and then almost
and the
immediately
money starts flowing.
Exactly.
Given what's going on in Europe and in Washington, Corina, I always go back to your point, which you've made many times, that the West and the U.S. in particular does not pay enough attention to all of this. Is that still the case? I think it's still below the threshold for a lot of people even who follow the region, where the talk is always about Ukraine or Belarus lately and that kind of thing.
I think it's gotten better. If I look at this year alone, I think we see a lot more focus from State Department and other actors here, and that's important. But there needs to be more, a little bit more. I think Romania is.
The Georgians always say this too.
Yeah,
we don't pay enough attention to that.
I think Romania is starting to say the right things. The EU, there's a special committee on Moldova, and there's going to be a report. So the European Parliament is paying attention. Of course, the largest group in the European Parliament is also paying attention. EPP, Maya Sandu's party, is a member of that. But then from all this words and pressure and then actually getting to the concrete actions, that's a distance, and that's always been the case. So again, I think this year and the months leading up to the presidential elections are going to be crucial, how we prepare for that. Now, I think we should also be prepared, if I can be the pessimist now, for the worst case scenarios. One of them being, for instance, so we know the socialists control the Constitutional Court now. That was one of the first alarming signs of the downfall of the Maya Sandu government earlier in this fall, in the summer. So you may remember some years ago, the Constitutional Court decided that the way the Constitution had been amended years ago was not constitutional. I know this is very complicated.
I remember this from my days at RFE. It was, I remember countless editorial meetings about this.
And so this is how, instead of the parliament electing the president, the people of Moldova got to elect the president of Moldova. And that was with Mr. Dodon 4 years ago.
Right, because there was this long period where there was no president because the parliament was incapable of electing the president.
And then the Constitutional Court came up with this creative idea. Well, wait a minute. The way we changed the Constitution 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, was not constitutional. So imagine something like this happens in the next few months when they say, oh, wait, we need to reverse this unjust decision because the Constitutional Court back then was under Plahotniuk's control, oligarchy control. So, we need to make justice.
So it goes back to the parliament to elect a president, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and then...
Which then you're not going to have a president for a long time, if history is any guide.
Well, yes and no, but if history is any guide, the Democratic Party and the Socialists have been perfectly okay cohabitating and voting along the same lines and working together. So I'm concerned about that.
Now, another piece, another kind of point that I kind of took away from Natalia Bugayeva's piece for Institute for the Study of War is that the alliance between the socialists and the Democrats is transactional. It's not based on any kind of principles.
Of course not.
And being transactional, it's very fragile. Would you agree with that?
It's fragile but stable, and it's been stable for years. I mean, Plahotniuk never really had a majority in the parliament, and yet he controlled everything because the socialists were playing along. And this has been done through a variety of means, through blackmail, through corruption, through
But
promises.
with him out of the picture now, do they still have that kind of leverage?
They still have the Democratic Party, from what I know from people in Moldova. The Democratic Party is kind of split, so there are at least two factions. One that is more aligned with the socialists, and one that is coalesced behind former Prime Minister Filip, that would perhaps be amenable
Filip
to...
or Filat?
Filip. Filat is from the Liberal Democratic Party. Just got out of prison.
Well, I was going to mention that because I thought that kind of was weird.
Possibly a challenge of sorts during the campaign next year. We can go into that a little bit if you want. But so former Prime Minister Filip. Rumor has it, people are observers, commentators in Moldova talk about him perhaps being amenable to a coalition with the pro-European forces.
With Acum.
Yes, in the future. Maia Sandu also gave an interview early this week or last week, in which she said she doesn't exclude the possibility of working with other political forces if they prove, some integrity, and so they will be doing some vetting as they have for the local elections.
So splits in the Democratic Party could work to Sandu's...
Could work.
And the socialists?
The socialists, I think, are using the same sort of weapons or tactics that Democrats under Plahotniuc were using against the socialists now. So they have all these methods of co-option. And of course, people want to be in parliament. They have access to resources, to power. They can appoint whoever, just extract rents and all that. So there are mutual benefits there. What's the alternative?
Right. Don, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to Russian behavior. I just find the apparent turnabout, the pivot, just remarkably, I would say, unified and abrupt, given how they operate elsewhere in the region.
You mean from the cooperation with the
Yes,
pro-West?
yes.
I mean, well, if you believe the pessimistic point, it was never a pivot. It was a tactical move.
Yeah, it was a way to get rid of
get rid of one, and now they get rid of another.
And I think that's where I would come down on this. Having got what they wanted over the short term last year, they now are going to put on the screws. But I'm trying very hard to share Corina's optimism. Not fully.
Well, first,
but I think you're right earlier when you talked about a lot of these things that the Russians promise and these treaties and these Eurasian bank things. Those are just things on paper.
They just signed a bunch of infrastructure and energy.
Where the real stuff goes on behind the scenes with money and the oligarchs and that kind of thing.
Well, this is the other thing I'm wondering is they tend to operate through oligarchic structures. Yeah. And which oligarchic structures are they operating through now that Plahotniuc's gone? Because he was the mother of all oligarchic structures in Moldova. Right, and I don't see any other Plahotniucs kind of rise, popping their heads up. I'm sure they exist.
I don't have insights on that, but I'm sure they will appear.
What did you make of Vlad Filat's unexpected release from prison on December 4th? Because that caught me by surprise. Apparently it caught Dodon by surprise, if you believe what he says, although I'm not sure I can believe what he says.
So it's interesting. If you read Moldovan media, you'll see there are two competing narratives. One is President Dodon's narrative, and he says, well, it was Maia Sandu let Filat out of prison. And then, of course, Maia Sandu says, well, nothing happens in the judiciary now since the control has moved from one group to the other without Dodon's knowledge.
Right.
So it was probably with Dodon's agreement that the release happened. Filat still has one pending corruption investigation. And I think if Filat re-entering the political scene in Moldova could dislocate some parts of the pro-Western electorate. That's where his initial positioning has been, leaving aside corruption charges and his behavior in power when he was ruling alongside and with support from Plahotniuc. So that is a possibility.
So you have him and Philippe coming back into the
Philippe
game.
we don't know yet what Filat is going to do and how he's going to play. There are rumors, I just heard from civil society activists in Moldova, that he gave a present to President Dodon, his media outlet. So he has a big media outlet in Moldova, and he apparently offered that to President Dodon. I hope it's not true, because that means, again, special attention for all of us. It means that Dodon is really now controlling most of the media market in Moldova.
Well, yeah, if you want to look at this really pessimistically, you assume, as you seem to be doing, that nothing happens in the courts without Dodon's approval. That Filat was a nominally pro-Western but very corrupt prime minister who was aligned with Plahotniuc. He would not have gotten released from prison without some conditionality. And it doesn't take too much imagination to figure out what that conditionality is. He's going to basically split Maya Sandu's electorate. I think that's what it looks like to me.
It's possible. I think
Right.
it's one of the scenarios. And I think it will be a test for Maya Sandu and her party and their ability to get the pro-European forces together under one umbrella, or
Right.
at least to support one candidate. It's
For
probably going to
president,
be
right.
Maya Sandu next year. They have, I think, better structures now at local level. I think they have this practice of working with Filat's former party, with the Liberal Democratic Party, at least with some parts of it, because they vetted all of the candidates, because they already had the infrastructure in the localities
Right.
and kind of in the rural areas and so on. So let's see what they've learned in the process and whether they're able to retain some of these people. It's unclear to me how much clout Filat he still has. There are no reliable at least opinion polls. There is one that came out recently that shows that PAS is coming second after the socialists. The difference is about 10 percentage points. But that's not, I don't think that's reliable. So we'll see what other, from IRI or NDI, if they do
Right.
opinion polls in the next months. So I think it's still... There's just a lot of unknowns
Right.
in terms of where Filat is going to play. And then there's another group of parties that amassed around 15% in the local elections, and we don't know where these parties are going to go. And these are the Unionist Parties, so parties that are advocating for Moldova's unification with Romania.
Okay.
And these parties they're definitely anti-Russian parties.
Right.
So if these parties can be persuaded, to kind of tone down their their pro-unionist discourse and be more pro-Western and follow that agenda and vote for Maya Sandu, I think that increases her chances. But there's a lot of political negotiation that will have to go, and I'm not sure that PAS has been able to develop all of those skills that they need
Right.
to make that happen. And perhaps that's where they need a little bit more Western support again from...
But that's what I'm hearing, is that she's going to be going into this next year's elections from a lot stronger baseline than she was going in last time, and she damn near won last time.
Yes, and she was she was completely inexperienced back then, and she didn't have any media support
Right.
and no party infrastructure. So I think her chances look a little better now. She hasn't been announced as the official candidate, but
it's pretty obvious.
It's pretty obvious that it's going to be her. And she has some successes under her belt, right? I mean, in local elections, perhaps not so much, but just from being prime minister and having been exposed to the governance process, and also just getting money to Moldova.
Right.
And all of a sudden, all of the doors being opened to her everywhere. So I think the electorate saw that.
Well, with elections coming up in both Georgia and Moldova next October, the being a Kremlin spin master in political technology is going to be a growth industry. I imagine we'll be seeing a lot more troll farms. Anything to add before we broaden the aperture and talk about Moldova in the context of the region?
Well, perhaps this is a good segue. I think just paying attention to the media space and the information space is going to be crucial. And I think this is where the U.S.'s strategic interests in the region align with Moldova's interests, I would say, or part of the Moldovan people, who want to maintain their independence.
I would argue their objective
sovereignty.
interests. But
Exactly. A point I think you made last time, too.
Yeah. And I think it's good not to lose sight of that.
All right. Well, that is a good segue. In a few moments, we'll continue our discussion and look at developments in Moldova in the context of broader geopolitical competition between Russia and the West in the former Soviet space. I'd like to remind you are listening to the Power Vertical podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. Joining me here in the studio is Corina Rebegea, director of the U.S.-Romania Initiative and fellow in residence here at SIPA. Also joining us is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. I'd also like to remind you could subscribe to the Power Vertical podcast on iTunes. You could read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at sipa.org, and you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. Developments in Moldova are, of course, not taking place in a vacuum. They are happening as Moscow appears to be consolidating its position in Georgia under pro-Russian oligarch Bidzina Ivanishvili, which is sparking persistent and growing street protests as that country heads into its crucial elections next year. And they are happening as the war in Ukraine enters a new and uncertain phase as Russia attempts to test novice President Volodymyr Zelensky. Don, the battle for these three countries it manifests itself as a hot war in Ukraine. It manifests itself as a frozen conflict in all three, and it manifests itself as a war of governance in all three.
Yeah, I would actually add another layer or two if I might.
You may.
Because I think that the Kremlin, at the moment at least, sees the West as on the defensive and divided. I think it seeks to consolidate, as you said, take advantage of that situation. I would note in passing that it seems to be much more of an emphasis in Russian foreign policy on Europe than there has been for some number of months.
Yeah.
And I think Lavrov here, and I think they see a situation in which they can consolidate, as you said, can press their advantage, and they want to take advantage of it. So what do we see in Russian behavior? We see, I would say, Normandy, an attempt to be outwardly a good citizen in Ukraine. At the same time, you see pushing advantage. No one believes it.
As good a citizen as you can be when you're occupying.
They're in the Normandy thing for a reason, which is to test Zelensky.
Yeah.
But they want to appear to be constructive, to lure people like Macron into thinking that somehow there's going to be a deal over Ukraine, which there won't be. So that let me qualify that. But you see advantage being pressed in Belarus, I think, in Moldova, and in Georgia, as you say. So a lot of this stuff is in some ways below the threshold of West's attention, as Corina says.
Yeah.
So you see a variety of behaviors based on a reading of
Yes.
those behaviors being in Europe, based on a reading that the West is to some extent divided and on the defensive. And so they're trying to move as appropriate tactically. And it takes different forms in different countries.
Yeah.
So if they can show the Europeans that they're constructive on Normandy, I don't believe that, they might get some concessions from the Macrons of the world. So you see a very...
But they're not going to get what they want in Ukraine until two things happen.
Thus, this may not last.
Right. I mean, I would argue they have already lost Ukraine. You and I have talked about this, and many others in this town who pay serious attention to Ukraine would certainly agree with us. They're not going to get what they want in Ukraine until Ukrainians decide that peace in the Donbass is more important than their sovereignty. And I don't see any sign of that happening. And they're not going to get what they want in Ukraine until the West fully withdraws support for Ukraine. And that is not happening despite all the things that are happening in the West that are alarming at the moment. So they're losing in Ukraine, and I believe, actually, I would argue they have lost. It's just a matter of working out the details.
Not that they realize that
they are winning in Georgia.
In Georgia?
They are winning.
Probably in Belarus?
Well, in Belarus, Belarus I put in a different category from these three states, but they're winning in Georgia despite the fact that there's a societal consensus.
Yeah.
Similar to Ukraine, if not stronger than in Ukraine, for moving west, but they're doing it because the West is not paying attention. They're doing it below, but they're doing it through oligarchic structures, and they're doing it kind of stealthily, but getting increasingly brazen right now. And this is going to come to a head by next year's parliamentary elections. In Moldova, we're in this deadlock right now. And again, I put Moldova in this kind of pre-Maidan Ukraine where you have a 50-50 divided society, red and blue, however you want to paint it or color it. Corina, you're dying to say something, so say it.
I did just a point of caution because we are using the narrative that pleases the Kremlin. The Kremlin has won in Moldova. There's a takeover. There's that they're winning and they're succeeding with their plans. This is what if you look at their official reports and the media, this is how they talk about the situation.
You mean by reducing this to a geopolitical struggle and pulling values out of the picture?
But I wouldn't say this with such finality, right? That the Kremlin has won, because, like I said, we don't have a baseline, and this is the narrative that they want us to use, and so we give up on Moldova because it's already too complicated to deal with it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would add to that when I'm saying who's winning and who's losing, and I'm going to use a phrase that is, I love this phrase, and it's also much beloved by our friend John Herbst over at the Atlantic Council, the Marxist phrase, correlation of forces. And what the West has going for it in all of these countries is that significant parts of the population don't view this as a geopolitical struggle. They view this as a battle of governance where they want to improve their lives.
Exactly. And I wanted to I made a note of what you said. It is a war of governance, and it's always been. And I think if the West put a little bit more strength behind its position, it would be winning. And I think we need to turn that narrative around. And I think there are a few things that can be done. And I think the European Union, but also kind of the transatlantic community, has been lukewarm on a rule of law and anti-corruption, ticking some boxes, setting some conditionalities, looking at some laws, and that's it, creating yet another program for training or whatever. How about looking at illicit money flows and actually doing something about that? How about looking at what happened to the international criminal warrants that are out for all of these national leaders and oligarchs? How about we take an active role of that? We open some investigations. Olaf perhaps could do that. You could argue that some of the money that's being stolen, even in Eastern Partnership countries, are actually violating the financial interests of the European Union. So it's direct impact on European Union money.
How about actually extraditing oligarchs who are wanted by allied governments? And I'm looking at you, Austria. Right?
But again, to repeat my point, which I think was not in disagreement with you, Corina, which is to say that there's an increased Kremlin emphasis on Europe recently, that they see the West as divided at least, and this provides opportunities to press for advantage, not winning or losing. And thus we see a variety of behaviors in the countries we've talked about, which I think reflect this. There's been little talk about China in the elites recently, and it may end quickly, but I speak of an emphasis, given what they read as a situation.
And just to close that, sorry, so if this seems bold that we need to go after criminals, let's offer, because it seems like
I think it's perfectly reasonable.
but I think we should offer clear membership prospects. That would really
I
scare
argued
Russia.
this at a 10th anniversary meeting about the European partnership. I said it's time we
they need a
stepped
date.
up, and it's not we, it's the Europeans.
It's the Europeans.
Needs to step up. This thing's existed for 10 years. And
it doesn't have to be, not even in the next decade, but that there needs to be a plan.
A prospect. Well, there needs to be a membership prospect.
That's
Absolutely,
it. I don't know,
yes.
2025, if we're comfortable with that date, 1st of January, that's when Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia are going to be members of the EU. Let's bring these countries up to that level and
I
then
agree,
work harder.
But since that won't happen, this creates
I mean,
opportunities
there are those
for
in the
mischief
EU
by
pushing
Russia.
for it. The Balts are pushing for it. The Poles are pushing
But
for it.
what's the alternative? I mean,
No, I agree with you.
The
There's no
Kremlin is
alternative.
doing its mischief.
No. There's no alternative. I agree with you. It's just that
It's a heavy political lift.
it's a heavy
is what you're
political
Yeah.
lift with certain countries we know of in Europe, and that's the disappointing thing about this. This provides the Kremlin opportunities to make mischief, I think.
Yeah, and with the expansion fatigue, I mean, I guess even without that formal membership perspective, there has to be diplomacy on the friends of these countries to convince them to move as if there were a membership perspective. I mean, the Balts moved hard on this before they even had this. They just acted as if this was happening, and we're going to make it impossible for you to say no to us. And I think the three kind of leading partnership countries, because I do think you have to. I would even argue you should have two separate structures.
Right.
And Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine should be in one. Belarus, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. Although I begin to start to think about moving Armenia into the first class as well. Maybe. The other thing I want to go back, what qualifies as winning here? When I say I see Moscow winning, I see them winning because they have captured the commanding heights of the Georgian political system, despite the wishes of the population, and they are capturing the commanding heights of the Moldovan political system. Despite the wishes of at least half of the Moldovan population, they are not capturing the commanding heights of the Ukrainian political system, which is driving them crazy. But because there's such a strong societal consensus in Ukraine now.
War will do that.
The war will do that. They were able to play this game before the war, just like they're playing it in Moldova. The game looked exactly the same. Georgia was the outlier then. Yeah. Moldova and Ukraine were the divided societies where Moscow was free to play. Georgia had the strong societal consensus. Now you have the situation where you have a strong societal consensus in Ukraine, still a strong one in Georgia, but the Russians have still managed to capture the commanding heights through all of that.
But without the plan that Corina suggests, which I agree with, the West, the situation is made for exploitation by Moscow, for drift, for contradiction, and that seems to be where we are. It's very unsatisfactory.
Well, I mean, stronger American leadership would always be good.
Exactly.
But at the end of the day, this is a job for the Europeans. Yeah. I mean, this is the EU's neighborhood. I would argue it is in the EU's interest to have thriving democracies on its border, not corrupt autocratic kleptocracies. I would argue it's in their national security interest to have that. I think brighter minds in Europe get that, but you got this enlargement fatigue, and it's 10 years into the European partnership. I think it is time to kind of
these things provide an
excuse
excuse not to expand, and unfortunately, there are a lot of people who think that way over there.
But to add to your point, Brian, I think this would be a great project for U.S.-EU cooperation.
Yeah.
I agree that this is mainly a EU issue because these countries are in the EU's neighborhood, but strategically they're part of the transatlantic space, and this is relevant for the U.S. This is a great project for the two entities, the two partners, to work together, kind of rebuild a little bit the relationship, which I think a lot of people would agree is not in the best shape. And perhaps, just multiplying the forces. And I think the U.S. has the political and military strength, and the EU has the financial and the good governance model. And I think together they could really make an impact if they worked in the same direction.
I mean, I'd like to see it happen. I'm still scarred by the Bucharest NATO summit. I know we're talking about NATO here, not the EU, but I was there in Bucharest, and I watched that thing play out. And I saw a situation where the United States, the United Kingdom, the Poles, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Baltic states all wanted Ukraine and Georgia to get membership action plans, and it didn't happen. It didn't happen. For me, this kind of put lie to Moscow's narrative that NATO is just this American colony that does everything that Washington tells it to do, when you had the US, the UK, and about half of the continent wanting one thing, and it was stopped because the Germans didn't want it.
And I want to challenge a little bit the enlargement fatigue, because I think politicians in Europe and elsewhere have no problem looking or promising things with very long time frames, knowing that they will not perhaps be in power, even if they're playing for it. So, politically, if you're a pragmatist, or it may not cost you that much to say in 15 years or in 20 years, Eastern Partnership countries will get membership in the EU, because you're actually placing that responsibility to someone else to deal with.
There isn't much more in terms of incentives you can offer them, because we've done the deep and comprehensive free trade agreements and the association agreements. We've done the visa-free travel.
Right.
What's left?
Well, what's left is that
a membership plan.
Membership plan. I mean, a perspective, a membership perspective.
Well, you sound like President Macron. He has a five stage, right? Was it five?
Mm-hmm.
5
Please
stage.
don't compare. Please don't.
It's not a bad comparison. But even that, I think just having stages, I think just something that leads you to 1st January of year whatever, you'll be a member of the EU.
All right. Well, we're obviously not going to solve all this here today on a Thursday.
Maybe we should run for office.
But, anything to add before we wrap it up?
Happy
for the week?
holidays to all our listeners and to both of you.
Well, that is all we have time for today. I'd like to remind you have been listening to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, Director of the Russia Program here at SIPA. Joining me here in the studio has been Corina Rebegea, Director of the U.S.-Romania Initiative and Fellow in Residence here at SIPA. Also joining us has been former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Thank you both for an enlightening discussion. I'd also like to thank our producer, Michal Harmata, for keeping the lights on and all the complicated machines well-oiled and in working order throughout our discussion. I'd also like to remind you can subscribe to the Power Vertical Podcast on iTunes. You could read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at SIPA.org, and you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. The Power Vertical will break for 2 weeks for the winter holidays. So from all of us at SIPA, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Kwanzaa, and Happy Winter Solstice. We'll be back in the second week in January, and until then, as always, I leave you with something other than the ambient sounds of my favorite socially conscious Russian rapper, Noise MC.